Christmas Eve, 1885. The streets of Austin, Texas lay silent under a winter moon, but this was not the peaceful hush of a holy night. This was the silence of dread, thick and suffocating, settling over the young capital like a burial shroud. Behind shuttered windows and barricaded doors, families huddled together, listening to every creak of settling timber, every whisper of wind against clapboard walls. Mothers clutched sleeping children closer. Husbands gripped axes and hunting rifles, their knuckles white in the lamplight. The city that had been booming with frontier optimism just months before now cowered in the darkness, transformed into a hunting ground where something unthinkable stalked the night. They were waiting for him. The one they could not name, could not see, could not stop. The predator who came in darkness and left only blood and horror in his wake. For nearly a year, this unseen killer had been dragging women from their beds, butchering them with a savagery that defied comprehension. 8 victims already. 8 lives torn apart in the most brutal fashion imaginable. And the authorities, those men tasked with protecting the innocent, seemed utterly powerless to prevent the next attack. What happens when a killer strikes without pattern, without mercy, and without leaving a trace that leads anywhere but deeper into nightmare? What happens when an entire city realizes that locked doors and loaded guns might not be enough? Austin was about to discover that some horrors cannot be explained away by reason or driven off by firelight. This was a reign of terror that would change American criminal history forever. A series of murders so shocking, so methodical, so utterly cruel that they would echo through the decades. And here is what makes the blood run cold even now, more than a century later. This predator was already hunting, already perfecting his terrible craft, years before London would tremble at the name Jack the Ripper. The darkness had come to Texas first. The new year of 1885 arrived in Austin, Texas, with the metallic taste of blood and the whisper of an axe blade cutting through winter air. In the early hours of New Year's Day, while respectable citizens slept off their celebrations in warm beds within stately Victorian homes, a woman named Molly Smith lay dying in the cramped servants' quarters behind the home where she worked. Her skull had been crushed with savage precision, the bone splintered like kindling beneath repeated blows from an axe wielded with terrible force. The weapon had descended again and again in the darkness, transforming a living woman into something scarcely recognizable as human in the span of minutes that must have felt like hours. Molly was 25 years old, an African-American servant woman who occupied one of the lowest rungs on Austin's rigidly stratified social ladder. She lived in a small cabin behind her employer's house on Cedar Avenue, a structure so modest it barely qualified as shelter by modern standards. One room, rough-hewn walls, a dirt floor in some accounts, wooden planks in others. The kind of dwelling that respectable white Austin preferred not to think about, tucked away behind the grand homes, where the real life of the city supposedly happened. When her employer discovered the scene that New Year's morning, the sight must have been overwhelming. Blood had pooled across the floor and splattered the walls in patterns that spoke of frenzied violence. Molly's body lay still, her injuries so severe that death had come mercifully fast. But she was not alone in that tiny cabin. Beside her lay Walter Spencer, her common-law husband, unconscious but breathing. His head too bore the marks of the axe, though the blows that had struck him had somehow failed to kill him. Whether this was mercy or accident, no one could say. The authorities arrived with the unhurried efficiency typical of investigations involving servant-class victims in the 1880s. Austin's police force in that era operated with resources and methods that would seem laughably primitive by modern standards. Crime scene investigation as we understand it today simply did not exist. Photography was still a cumbersome process. Fingerprinting was years away from adoption in American police work, and the very concept of forensic evidence was in its infancy. What passed for investigating a murder scene in 1884 involved little more than looking around, noting obvious details, and forming quick conclusions based on prevailing assumptions rather than careful analysis. Officers walked through blood, handled potential evidence with bare hands, and allowed curious neighbors to trample through the scene. The cabin where Molly died was examined with eyes already predisposed to see what they expected rather than what might actually be there. And what those eyes expected to see was simple. This was a domestic dispute gone violent. A quarrel between a servant woman and her man, lubricated by holiday spirits and ending in tragedy. Such things happened among that class of people, or so the thinking went. Regrettable, certainly, but hardly surprising, and certainly not a matter requiring extensive investigation or community alarm. The authorities questioned Walter Spencer when he regained consciousness, though his testimony was confused and fragmentary. His head had been split open by an axe. That he could speak at all was remarkable. That his words might be muddled, contradictory, or incomplete was entirely expected, given the severity of his injuries. But the police seemed less interested in what Walter could tell them about an intruder or attacker than in building a case for the narrative they had already constructed. Walter insisted he had not harmed Molly. He spoke of an intruder, a figure in the darkness, though his descriptions were vague and shifting. He could not explain why he was unconscious rather than dead, could not provide details that would identify the attacker, could not offer the kind of clear, coherent account that might have redirected the investigation. His words came thick with pain and confusion, and the authorities heard in that confusion exactly what they wanted to hear, the evasions of a guilty man. The fact that Walter himself had nearly been murdered seemed to carry little weight in the calculations of justice. That his injuries were severe enough to have killed him spoke less to his innocence than to the incompleteness of the violence, as if he had attacked Molly and then, in some fit of remorse or accident, injured himself. Never mind that the wounds to his head suggested the same downward blows that had killed Molly, the same pattern of attack. Never mind that a man in the process of striking himself in the head with an axe would be unlikely to achieve the force and angle evident in Walter's injuries. The white community of Austin took almost no notice of Molly Smith's death. A servant woman killed in her cabin was not news that penetrated the careful boundaries of respectable society. There were no newspaper articles demanding justice, no editorials decrying the violence, no community meetings to discuss safety concerns. The murder of Molly Smith generated barely a ripple in the public consciousness of the city. This dismissive attitude reflected the brutal realities of Victorian-era prejudice and the devaluation of African American lives, particularly the lives of servant women. Molly existed in a social category that made her nearly invisible to the white establishment, except when her labor was needed. Her death was treated as an unfortunate incident within a population whose internal affairs were of little concern to those in power. The servant quarters of Victorian Austin were another world, separated from the main houses by more than just the few yards of yard and garden that physically divided them. They were spaces of profound vulnerability, isolated from help, unprotected by the social mechanisms that might have offered some measure of safety to women of higher social standing. Servants lived at the mercy of their employers' goodwill and their neighbors' restraint, with little recourse when violence came calling. Molly's cabin was one of dozens scattered through Austin's better neighborhoods, small structures barely visible from the street, housing the men and women who cooked, cleaned, laundered, and served. These were spaces the white community preferred to ignore, acknowledging their necessity while maintaining a careful psychological distance from the human realities they contained. In this context, the initial misreading of Molly's murder was not simply an investigative error, but a reflection of systemic disregard. The authorities saw what they expected to see because to see anything else would have required acknowledging uncomfortable truths about violence, vulnerability, and the inadequacy of protection for Austin's most marginalized resident. That this initial misreading would prove catastrophic is an understatement that barely captures the horror to come. Molly Smith was not the victim of a domestic dispute. She was the first victim of a serial killer who would terrorize Austin for more than a year, claiming at least 8 lives and spreading fear through every level of society. But in those early days of January 1885, no one knew this. No one was looking for a pattern because no one was really looking at all. The murder weapon, an axe, should have given pause. Axes were farm tools, implements for splitting wood and clearing land. They were not typical weapons of domestic violence, which more commonly involved knives, firearms, or blunt objects grabbed in the heat of an argument. An axe suggested premeditation, a weapon brought to the scene for the specific purpose of killing. But this detail too was overlooked in the rush to classify and dismiss. The brutality of the attack should also have raised questions. This was not a single blow struck in anger, but repeated, devastating strikes that continued long past the point of death. This was violence that exceeded the requirements of murder and entered the realm of rage or ritual. But again, Prevailing prejudices provided an easy explanation. Violence within the servant class was assumed to be more brutal, more primitive, less controlled than violence among the respectable classes. And so Molly Smith was buried, Walter Spencer was regarded with suspicion, but never formally charged, and Austin moved on with the casual indifference of a city that had convinced itself this was an isolated incident of no broader significance. The small cabin behind the house on Cedar Avenue was cleaned, the blood scrubbed away, and life continued as before. What no one realized as winter settled over Austin was that the killer was still out there, and the killing had only just begun. The spring of 1885 slipped into summer, and with the warming nights came a darkness that would forever change Austin, Texas. The killings that had seemed like isolated horrors were about to reveal themselves as something far more terrifying, a pattern of predation that would shatter any illusion of safety in the growing capital city. On the night of May 6, 1885, the killer returned. Eliza Shelley was a hard-working woman, known throughout her neighborhood for her quiet demeanor and devoted service to the family that employed her. Like so many women of color in Austin at that time, she lived in the servants' quarters behind a prominent white household, a small structure that offered minimal protection from the elements and even less from what lurked in the shadows. The quarters where servants slept were typically nothing more than rudimentary wooden buildings, sometimes little better than sheds, situated at the rear of the property where they would be out of sight of the main house and its occupants. That night, Eliza retired to her quarters as she always did, likely exhausted from the day's labor. The moon hung somewhere above the Texas sky, and the streets of Austin settled into the quiet rhythms of darkness. But someone was watching, waiting, calculating the perfect moment to strike. When morning came, the scene that greeted those who found Eliza was one of unspeakable horror. She had been attacked in her bed with savage brutality. The weapon this time was an axe, and the killer had wielded it with terrifying force. The wounds inflicted upon Eliza spoke to a rage that went beyond simple murder, beyond even the violence of a robbery gone wrong. This was something else entirely, something that made even hardened men turn away in revulsion. But the details that truly chilled investigators were the ones that connected this murder to the previous attacks. Eliza's body had been dragged from her quarters, pulled outside into the yard as if the killer wanted to display his work. Her nightclothes were torn and disheveled in ways that suggested a sexual component to the attack. And most disturbingly, there were no witnesses. No one had heard her screams. No one had seen a figure fleeing into the night. The killer had once again materialized like smoke, committed unspeakable acts, and vanished without a trace. The newspapers initially reported the murder with the same detached tone they had used for previous attacks, but within the servant community, a different conversation was beginning. Women whispered to each other in marketplaces and on street corners. They began to notice what the authorities had been slow to acknowledge. The victims were all servants. They were all women. They were all attacked at night in their quarters. And they were all subjected to the same ritualistic violence. Just weeks later, on May 23rd, the pattern repeated itself with horrifying precision. Irene Cross lived in similar circumstances to Eliza Shelley, in the servant quarters behind a well-to-do home in a different part of Austin. She too was a woman known for her reliability and hard work. And she too became a target of the predator who was now clearly hunting through the city with deliberate intent. The attack on Irene followed the same nightmarish script. She was assaulted in her bed while she slept, bludgeoned with what investigators believed was an iron rod. The force of the blows shattered bone and tore flesh. The killer showed no mercy, no hesitation, no humanity. Medical examination would later reveal that Irene, like the others, had been sexually assaulted, though the delicate sensibilities of the era meant that newspapers rarely spelled out these details explicitly. Instead, they used euphemisms that everyone understood but no one wanted to acknowledge directly. Her body was found outside her quarters, dragged into the yard in the same manner as Eliza's had been. The killer was following a ritual, performing the same acts in the same sequence. This was not random violence. This was a pattern, a signature, the mark of someone who had killed before and would kill again. By now, Marshal Grooms Lee, the head of Austin's small police force, could no longer deny what was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone in the city. Austin had a serial predator in its midst, The term serial killer would not enter common usage for nearly another century, but the concept was ancient. What Lee and his officers faced was a hunter who selected his prey carefully, who struck with calculated violence, and who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to evade detection. The police force in Austin at that time was woefully unprepared for such an investigation. Modern forensic techniques did not exist. There were no fingerprint databases, no criminal profiling, no DNA analysis. What they had were witness statements, which were non-existent, and physical evidence that told them only that the killer was strong, violent, and bold enough to attack women mere yards from occupied homes without raising an alarm. Marshal Lee increased patrols. He assigned officers to walk the neighborhoods where servants lived. He issued public warnings urging women to take precautions. But the city was growing rapidly. The police force was small, and the killer seemed to know exactly when and where to strike to avoid detection. The summer heat bore down on Austin, and with it came an oppressive atmosphere of dread. In the servant quarters behind the grand homes of Austin's elite, women lay awake at night listening to every sound, every creak of wood, every rustle of leaves. They knew they were vulnerable. They knew the police could not protect them. They knew that when darkness fell, the killer might choose their quarters next. Then, on August 30th, 1885, he struck again. Clara Dick was the latest victim in what had now become an undeniable series of connected murders. The attack followed the same pattern with such precision that it seemed almost scripted. Nighttime assault, extreme violence with a blunt instrument, the body dragged outside, evidence of sexual assault. Clara's murder was in many ways the most terrifying yet, not because it was more violent than the others, but because it proved that the killer was accelerating. The time between attacks was shortening. His confidence was growing. The scene at Clara Dick's quarters revealed the same maddening lack of evidence that had characterized all the previous murders. No footprints that led anywhere useful. No murder weapon left behind. No witnesses who had seen or heard anything that could identify the killer. He moved through the night like a phantom, a ghost who could materialize beside a sleeping woman, commit acts of unimaginable violence, and disappear before anyone could raise an alarm. The panic that had been building in Austin's servant community now exploded into outright terror. Women refused to sleep alone. In quarters all across the city, female servants began sleeping in groups, crowding into small rooms that were barely adequate for one person, let alone 3 or 4. They reasoned that there was safety in numbers, that the killer would be deterred by multiple potential witnesses. Men from the community, husbands and brothers and fathers, organized themselves into informal watch groups. They armed themselves with whatever weapons they could obtain, shotguns and rifles if they had them, axes and clubs if they did not. Every night, these men would position themselves outside the servant quarters, standing guard through the long hours of darkness, watching the shadows, listening for any sound that might signal danger. The purchase of firearms surged among those who could afford them. Hardware stores reported selling out of locks and bolts as women tried to fortify their flimsy quarters against an intruder who had proven capable of entering locked rooms without difficulty. Some women took to sleeping with knives under their pillows or heavy objects within reach. Others prayed, hoping that divine intervention might protect them where human measures seemed to fail. But despite all these precautions, despite the armed guards and the increased police patrols and the communal sleeping arrangements, the killer continued to evade capture. He seemed to know where the guards would be positioned. He seemed to sense which quarters would be empty or insufficiently protected. Some began to whisper that he must be someone local, someone who knew the layout of the city intimately, who could navigate the back alleys and servants' lanes in complete darkness. Others suggested something more sinister, that he was something other than human, a demon or evil spirit that could pass through walls and locks as easily as smoke through a screen. These supernatural explanations gained traction among a frightened population desperate for any explanation that might help them understand the incomprehensible. The newspapers now openly discussed the connection between the murders. Headlines screamed about the reign of terror gripping Austin. Editorials demanded action from the police and city officials. The story had captured attention beyond Austin, with newspapers in San Antonio, Houston, and even as far away as New York beginning to report on the mysterious killings in the Texas capital. Marshal Lee found himself under enormous pressure. The city council demanded results. The public wanted arrests. But how do you catch a ghost? How do you stop a predator who leaves no trail, who strikes without warning, and who seems to vanish into thin air after each attack? Lee and his officers worked long hours, following leads that went nowhere, interviewing hundreds of people who had seen nothing useful, examining crime scenes that yielded no actionable evidence. The summer of 1885 was one that Austin would never forget. The heat was oppressive, but the fear was worse. In the grand homes of the wealthy, life continued with a semblance of normalcy, though even the most privileged citizens could not entirely ignore the violence unfolding in the servant quarters behind their home. In those quarters themselves, life had become a waking nightmare, a desperate struggle to survive until morning, when the killer would retreat to wherever he hid during the daylight hours. 3 women dead in less than 4 months, all killed in the same way, all targeted in their most vulnerable moments. The pattern was clear, undeniable, and terrifying. Austin had a serial killer, and as the summer faded toward autumn, no one knew when or where he would strike next. The night of September 28, 1885, began like any other in Austin, Texas. Respectable families locked their doors as darkness fell, though by now the ritual had taken on a desperate quality. For months, a nameless terror had stalked the streets, claiming victims in their beds while the city slept. But there was a pattern, an unspoken logic that offered cold comfort to some. The creature, the demon, the annihilator as the newspapers had taken to calling him, he selected his prey from the margins. Poor women, servant women. Women whose skin marked them as somehow less deserving of protection in the eyes of polite society. On this night, that terrible equation would be shattered forever. Sue Hancock lived in a world insulated by wealth and privilege. Her home stood as a monument to prosperity, with its proper furnishings and manicured grounds. She was a white woman of good standing, married to a man of means, protected by all the social armor that 1880s Austin could provide. In the logic that had governed the city's response to the murders thus far, she should have been untouchable. The killer had established a type, the authorities reasoned. He preyed on vulnerability, on women who lived at the edges, women whose deaths might be mourned quietly, but would not shake the foundations of the social order. Moses Hancock, Sue's husband, would later describe the evening as unremarkable. They had retired to their separate bedrooms, as was customary for couples of their station. He remembered feeling unusually drowsy, a heaviness that pulled him down into sleep with uncommon force. This detail would haunt investigators and fuel speculation for years to come. Had the killer studied the house? Had he somehow entered earlier, slipping something into Moses's evening drink? The depth of his sleep that night was profound, unnatural. While his wife died mere feet away, he heard nothing. Not the window being forced open. Not the footsteps crossing her bedroom floor. Not her screams, if she had the chance to scream at all. When morning light finally broke through the windows, Moses awoke to a scene that would be seared into Austin's collective memory. Sue Hancock lay in her bed, but she was no longer recognizable as the woman he had kissed goodnight hours before. Her skull had been crushed with savage force, struck again and again until the delicate architecture of bone and brain had been reduced to ruin. Blood soaked through the fine linens, pooling on the floor, spattering the walls in patterns that spoke of frenzied violence. This was not a quick death. This was rage made manifest, hatred given physical form. But the horror that morning had not yet reached its full depths. As word spread and neighbors gathered, as the inadequate police force scrambled to respond, someone thought to check on Eula Phillips. She had been employed as a servant in the Hancock household, one of the many invisible hands that kept the machinery of wealthy homes running smoothly. Her small quarters were located behind the main house, in the spaces reserved for those whose labor was valued, but whose presence was meant to remain discreet. They found Eula outside, and what had been done to her transcended the violence inflicted on Sue Hancock. Her body had been mutilated with a thoroughness that suggested something beyond murder, something ritualistic and profoundly disturbing. The newspapers of the day struggled with how to describe what had been discovered, ultimately falling back on phrases like desecrated beyond recognition and subjected to horrors too terrible to print. The killer had taken his time with Eula. While Sue Hancock had been killed in her bed, swiftly if brutally, Eula had been transformed into a message, a statement written in flesh and blood. The question that seized Austin in the days following was unavoidable and terrifying. Were these two deaths the work of the same hand that had killed before? The earlier murders had followed a pattern, targeting women who worked as servants, women who were often alone, often vulnerable in ways that respectable society preferred not to examine too closely. But now the killer had climbed the social ladder, invading the sanctum of wealth and whiteness that was supposed to offer protection. Had the Annihilator evolved? Had his appetites expanded, his confidence grown to the point where no woman in Austin could consider herself safe? Some investigators, desperate for any theory that might make sense of the senseless, suggested these might be copycat crimes. Perhaps someone had studied the earlier murders and decided to use them as cover for a more personal motive. Moses Hancock found himself under suspicion, though the depth of his sleep that night and his obvious devastation seemed genuine. Others whispered about servants who might harbor resentments, about grudges festering in the shadows of grand homes. But these theories felt hollow, grasping. The signature was too similar, the methods too aligned with what had come before. What no one could deny was how the investigation transformed overnight. When poor women had died, when their bodies had been discovered in modest dwellings on the outskirts of town, the response had been measured, almost bureaucratic. Resources were limited, the authorities explained. The police force was small. These things took time. But Sue Hancock's death changed the calculus completely. She was one of their own, a woman whose murder could not be quietly filed away or attributed to the dangers of living in rough neighborhood. Within hours, rewards were doubled, then tripled. Private detectives were hired. The governor became personally involved, demanding updates and applying pressure. Newspapers across the nation picked up the story, transforming what had been a regional concern into a national scandal. Austin, the capital of Texas, was being terrorized by a monster who could strike anywhere, who respected neither wealth nor race nor social position. The headlines screamed the news in bold type. Respectable ladies were being slaughtered in their beds. If it could happen to Sue Hancock, it could happen to anyone. The class and racial dynamics at play were impossible to ignore, though few spoke of them directly. The earlier victims had names too. They had families who mourned them, communities that felt their loss. But their deaths had not triggered this level of response, had not brought governors and national newspapers into the story. It took the murder of a white woman of means to transform the Annihilator from a local problem into a crisis that demanded immediate action and unlimited resources. Some of the earlier victims had been women of color, and their murders had been noted with a paragraph or two in the back pages. Others had been white but poor servants and washerwomen whose social standing offered little protection in life and less attention in death. The message was clear, though it was never stated plainly. In the economy of grief and outrage that governed 1880s America, some lives simply mattered more than others. Some deaths demanded justice, while others could be quietly forgotten. The investigation now sprawled across the city with unprecedented intensity. Every door was knocked upon. Every stranger was questioned. Theories multiplied like weeds after rain. Perhaps the killer was a doctor, someone suggested, given the surgical precision of some of the mutilations. Maybe he was a drifter who rode the rails into Austin and disappeared again before dawn. Could it be someone in a position of trust? Someone whose presence in respectable neighborhoods would raise no alarms? The speculation became its own form of paranoia, turning neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. Eula Phillips, in death, remained somehow separate from Sue Hancock, even as their murders were inextricably linked. The coverage of her killing was briefer, the descriptions more clinical. She had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, some accounts suggested, as if her death was incidental to the real tragedy of Sue Hancock's murder. But those who examined the crime scene knew differently. The violence inflicted on Eula had been extensive, deliberate. She had not been an afterthought. Whatever darkness drove the killer, it had expressed itself fully on her body. As autumn deepened over Austin, the city existed in a state of siege. Women refused to sleep alone. Families barricaded their doors with furniture. Men formed patrols, walking the streets through the night with weapons at hand. The evolution of the killer, if indeed it was the same man, suggested something deeply troubling about the nature of evil. He was not content to repeat the same crimes endlessly. He was learning, adapting, perhaps even enjoying the terror he created. The carefully maintained boundaries of class and race had proven permeable, and now no one knew where he might strike next. The double murder of Sue Hancock and Eula Phillips marked a turning point in the story of Austin's nightmare. It transformed the narrative from one of contained horror, terrible but limited in scope, to something far more universal and threatening. The killer had shown he could reach anyone, anywhere. And in doing so, he had exposed the uncomfortable truth about which lived society truly valued, and which it was willing to let slip into darkness with barely a whisper of protest. The darkness came earlier to Austin in the winter months of 1885, and with it came a fear so thick you could almost taste it on the cold December air. As the sun dipped below the Texas horizon, the city transformed into something unrecognizable, a place where every shadow held menace and every sound carried the weight of potential horror. This was no longer the bustling capital city that had proudly stood as the seat of Texas government. This was a city under siege by an invisible enemy, a place where terror had become as common as the evening lamplight. By late 1885, the rituals of fear had become woven into the very fabric of daily life. Shop owners who once stayed open until 8 or 9 in the evening now shuttered their windows and bolted their doors well before sunset. The streets that had previously hummed with evening commerce fell silent as dusk approached. Merchants made their calculations quickly, weighing the cost of lost business against the price of staying open after dark. The equation was simple and stark. No amount of profit was worth the risk of walking home through streets that might harbor a monster. The sound of hammers striking nails echoed through neighborhoods as families fortified their homes. Windows that had stood open to catch the evening breeze were now reinforced with additional latches and bars. Doors received extra bolts, sometimes 3 or 4 locks where one had previously sufficed. Hardware stores sold out of their inventory of security devices within days, and blacksmiths found themselves overwhelmed with custom orders for window grates and reinforced door frames. As night fell, the armed patrols began their rounds. These were not official police officers, though the overwhelmed department welcomed their assistance. These were vigilante citizens, ordinary men who had transformed themselves into protectors of their neighborhoods. They walked in groups of 4 or 5, carrying shotguns, rifles, and pistols. Some carried lanterns, casting pools of flickering light that seemed only to make the surrounding darkness more oppressive. Others preferred to move through the shadows, believing they might catch the killer by surprise if they remained unseen. The sound of dogs barking pierced the night air constantly. Families who had never owned dogs before now kept them chained in their yards, living alarm systems that might provide a few precious seconds of warning. The cacophony of barking created its own form of terror, as every howl sent hearts racing and hands reaching for weapons. Was it just a stray cat that had set off the animals, or was something more sinister moving through the darkness? Inside their homes, families created new sleeping arrangements dictated entirely by fear. Husbands moved loaded guns to their bedsides, checking and rechecking that the weapons were ready to fire. Some families abandoned their bedrooms entirely, sleeping together in central rooms with fewer windows and more exits. Children were brought into parents' rooms, not for comfort, but for protection. The logic was simple, but heartbreaking. If the killer came, at least the family would be together, able to defend each other or die trying. Women stopped sleeping alone entirely. Those who lived by themselves moved in with relatives or friends, creating impromptu boarding arrangements that sometimes packed 10 or 12 people into houses meant for half that number. The alternative, sleeping alone in a dwelling with a separate entrance or in a servant's quarters, had become unthinkable. Every woman in Austin knew the pattern by now. The killer preferred women who slept alone, or with only another woman nearby. He chose victims who lived in structures separated from main houses or in homes where help could not arrive quickly. This realization triggered the Great Exodus. Servant women, primarily African American and poor white women who worked as domestics in wealthy households, began fleeing the city in numbers that shocked the elite families who employed them. These women had no choice but to recognize the obvious pattern. 7 of the 8 victims had been servant women, women just like them, women who slept in small quarters behind big houses or in modest homes in working-class neighborhoods. The message was clear and terrifying. They were the targets. The trains and stagecoaches leaving Austin filled with servant women heading anywhere that was not here. They went to San Antonio, to Houston, to small towns and rural areas where they had family or friends. Some had no destination at all, just a desperate need to escape a city that had become a hunting ground. The economic impact on wealthy households was immediate and dramatic. Women who had relied on servants to run their large homes suddenly found themselves doing their own cooking, cleaning, and childcare. It was a disruption they had never anticipated, and their complaints filled the society pages of newspapers, even as those same papers documented the murders that had caused the crisis. But the wealthy women's inconvenience paled in comparison to the economic catastrophe facing the women who fled. These were women who lived paycheck to paycheck, who supported families with their domestic work. Leaving meant abandoning their income, their housing, and often the only work they knew how to do. Yet they left anyway, because staying meant the possibility of becoming the next body discovered in the morning light, violated and destroyed by an unknown killer. Into the vacuum of knowledge rushed theories, wild speculation that grew more elaborate with each passing day. The newspapers printed every rumor, every half-baked hypothesis that reached their ears. One theory focused on a Malay cook who had been employed at several of the victims' homes or neighboring properties. According to this theory, the cook had brought with him some Eastern knowledge of stealth and murder, turning his culinary skills into a cover for his nocturnal predations. The theory gained enough traction that every Asian person in Austin found themselves viewed with suspicion, their lives made miserable by the city's desperate need to identify an outsider as the killer. Another popular theory suggested an escaped lunatic from some distant asylum. This explanation had a comforting element to it. If the killer was insane, then his actions were random, meaningless, the product of a broken mind rather than a calculated evil. People could imagine this lunatic as a wild-eyed, obviously deranged figure who might be easily identified if only someone spotted him. The reality, that the killer was likely someone who appeared perfectly normal, was too frightening to contemplate. Some whispered about a vengeful former slave, someone seeking retribution for the horrors of bondage by striking at white households through their servants. This theory revealed the racial anxieties of the time, the fear among white residents that the relatively recent end of slavery might produce violent revenge. The theory conveniently ignored that several of the victims were themselves black women, but logic rarely survives contact with mass hysteria. The most disturbing theories abandoned human perpetrators entirely. Witnesses claimed to have seen a half-human creature, something between a man and an animal, moving through the darkness. These accounts described a figure of enormous size and strength, capable of superhuman speed and silence. Some said it had glowing eyes. Others claimed it moved on all fours like a beast, but could stand and walk like a man. These supernatural explanations spread through the working-class neighborhoods like wildfire, passed along in whispers and fearful conversations. The police department, led by a marshal who was increasingly desperate and out of his depth, tried everything. They attempted what we might now recognize as primitive criminal profiling. They theorized that the killer must live near the victims, that he must be someone who could move through neighborhoods without attracting attention, that he must have medical knowledge given the nature of the mutilations. These deductions were logical but led nowhere, producing no viable suspects despite their reasoning. Mass interrogations became the order of the day. Officers hauled in hundreds of men for questioning anyone who seemed suspicious or who had been mentioned in a rumor. Black men found themselves particularly targeted, arrested on the flimsiest pretext, and subjected to harsh interrogations that sometimes crossed into brutality. The jail filled with men, held on vague charges of suspicious behavior or vagrancy. Men who were almost certainly innocent, but who made convenient scapegoats for a city demanding action. In one of the most desperate and degrading measures, the department deployed officers in women's clothing as bait. These policemen dressed in long skirts and wigs, attempting to present themselves as vulnerable targets who might lure the killer into attacking. They walked through high-risk neighborhoods after dark, sweating under their disguises, hoping and also dreading that they might attract the killer's attention. The operations were spectacularly unsuccessful. The killer, whether through luck or cunning, never took the bait. The officers endured mockery from their colleagues and accomplished nothing beyond demonstrating the department's complete lack of effective strategies. The city government, under enormous pressure to do something, offered a reward of $500 for information leading to the killer's capture. This was a substantial sum, equivalent to a year's wages for many working people. The announcement of the reward triggered a flood of tips, accusations, and denunciations. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Personal grudges were dressed up as criminal suspicions. The police found themselves drowning in useless information, chasing hundreds of false leads while the real killer remained free. The newspapers bore significant responsibility for the escalating hysteria. They competed with each other to produce the most sensational coverage, the most lurid details, the most frightening speculation. Headlines screamed warnings and theories in type so large it could be read from across the street. Illustrations depicted the crime scenes in graphic detail, showing violated bodies and blood-soaked rooms. Reporters interviewed anyone who would talk, printing their wild theories and unverified claims as if they were established facts. The coverage sold newspapers in unprecedented numbers, and the publishers showed little inclination to calm the panic that was so profitable. Yet amid all the fear and failed investigations, something remarkable was happening. Austin was becoming, quite unintentionally, a laboratory for early forensic investigation. Officers began attempting to preserve crime scenes, though they had little understanding of what evidence might be important. They made sketches and took measurements, creating primitive documentation that anticipated modern crime scene procedures. They tried to track the killer's movements by studying footprints and marks in the dirt, an early form of trace evidence analysis. They attempted to find patterns in the timing and location of attacks, creating maps that plotted each crime scene. This geographical profiling, crude as it was, represented genuine innovation. They theorized about the killer's psychology, asking why he chose certain victims and not others, what his mutilations might reveal about his mind. These questions would not be systematically addressed by criminal psychology for decades to come, but Austin's investigators were grasping toward them in 1885. The tragedy was that they had almost no tools to work with. Fingerprinting would not be adopted for forensic use for another 15 years. Blood typing was unknown. DNA analysis was nearly a century in the future. They could not determine if blood at different crime scenes came from the same perpetrator. They had no way to chemically analyze trace evidence. Photography was available but expensive and technically challenging. Most crime scenes were never photographed at all. As winter deepened and 1886 approached, Austin remained a city, transformed by terror. A place where darkness brought not rest, but fear, where every sound might herald death. The investigation continued, but hope faded with each passing day that brought no arrest, no answers, only more questions, and the constant dread that the killer would strike again. The city of Austin had endured a nightmare for nearly a year, but nothing could have prepared its citizens for what would unfold in the dark hours before Christmas 1885. As families prepared for the most sacred of holidays, trimming trees and wrapping gifts in brown paper, a predator moved through the shadows with terrifying purpose. What happened in those frigid December hours would cement this killer's place in the annals of American crime, not just for the brutality of the acts themselves, but for the sheer audacity of executing multiple attacks across different locations in a single night. The coordination required seemed beyond human capability, leading many to whisper that something supernatural stalked their streets. May Tobin lived in a small servant's quarters behind a home on Water Street, near the heart of the city. She was a young woman, barely into her 20s, trying to make an honest living in difficult times. On the evening of December 24th, she had a visitor, a friend named Orange Washington. The two had planned a modest Christmas Eve together, perhaps sharing what little food and warmth they could afford. Neither could have known they were marking time until their deaths. Somewhere in those same hours, another woman named Patsy Gibson prepared for bed in her own small home across town. She had no connection to May Tobin or Orange Washington. The three moved in different circles, knew different people, walked different streets. Yet, the Annihilator had selected them all for this one horrific night. The timeline of what occurred remains chilling even now, more than a century later. Investigators would later attempt to reconstruct the sequence of events, trying desperately to understand how one person could inflict such carnage across multiple crime scenes in mere hours. The answer would prove elusive, adding to the almost mythical quality of the terror. At May Tobin's residence, The killer arrived sometime after nightfall. The small quarters offered little security, just a simple door with a basic latch. Whether the attacker broke in or gained entry through deception remains unknown. What is certain is that both May and Orange were caught off guard. The violence that followed was beyond comprehension. The killer used an axe, the same signature weapon that had terrorized Austin for months. But on this night, the fury seemed amplified, as if the murderer was working toward some terrible crescendo. May Taubin was struck with such force that her skull shattered. The newspapers of the time, which had grown increasingly graphic in their reporting as the public demanded every detail, described wounds that spoke of sustained, frenzied attack. This was not the quick work of an assassin. This was rage made manifest. Orange Washington fought back. Evidence at the scene suggested a desperate struggle. Furniture was overturned, belongings scattered across the small room. But against the axe, against the element of surprise, against the practiced hand of a serial killer, resistance proved futile. Orange suffered wounds similar to May's, the axe falling again and again until both victims lay still. But the killer was not finished. In a detail that haunted investigators and the public alike, the murderer then arranged the bodies. This post-mortem staging had become a signature element of the attacks, a perverse calling card that suggested the killer derived some twisted satisfaction from the placement of the dead. The specifics were considered too disturbing for even the scandal-hungry newspapers to print in full, though whispers spread through the community about violations and desecrations that went far beyond murder. While May Taubin and Orange Washington lay dead in their small room, the killer moved through the night to another location entirely. Patsy Gibson's home stood several blocks away, far enough that the idea of one person traveling between the two scenes, committing such elaborate violence at each, seemed nearly impossible. Yet that is precisely what happened. Patsy Gibson was asleep when her nightmare began. The attacker entered her home in the dead of night, moving with the confidence of someone who had done this before. Patsy woke to find a figure looming over her bed, and in that moment of recognition, her fate seemed sealed. The killer grabbed her, yanking her from the bed with tremendous force. She screamed, but in that neighborhood, at that hour, screams might go unheeded or be mistaken for something else. The attacker dragged her through her own home, and here the assault began. The axe fell, striking Patsy in the head with devastating force. She collapsed, blood streaming from the wound. The killer struck again, and again, until Patsy lay motionless. Satisfied that she was dead, the murderer fled into the night. But Patsy Gibson was not dead. Against all probability, despite wounds that should have been instantly fatal, she clung to life. Her survival would prove crucial to the investigation, though maddeningly, her testimony would raise more questions than it answered. Christmas morning dawned cold and gray over Austin. While children elsewhere woke to discover gifts and treats, the residents of Water Street were about to discover something far different. A neighbor, perhaps coming to wish May Taubin a Merry Christmas, approached the small servants' quarters. The doors stood ajar. Inside, the scene was beyond horror. The neighbor's screams brought others running. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered, people pushing forward to see, then recoiling in shock and revulsion. Many of those who glimpsed the interior of that small room would be haunted by the sight for the rest of their lives. Blood covered the walls and floor. The bodies of May Taubin and Orange Washington lay in positions that suggested their final moments had been filled with unimaginable terror and pain. Word spread through Austin with the speed of wildfire. Christmas morning services were interrupted with the news. Families abandoned their celebrations and poured into the streets. By mid-morning, the city had erupted into chaos. Then came word of the attack on Patsy Gibson. She had been found by her own family, barely alive, her head covered in blood. As doctors worked frantically to save her, the full scope of the Christmas Eve massacre became clear. The Annihilator had struck not once but multiple times, claiming 3 victims in a single night, with a 4th left for dead. The public response went far beyond fear. This was primal, collective rage. Austin had endured attack after attack, watching as their police force failed to stop the killer, as their city became synonymous with unsolved murder. Now, on Christmas morning, with bodies still warm and blood still wet, the thin veneer of civilized order shattered completely. Lynch mobs formed within hours. Groups of men, many armed, began roaming the streets seeking suspects. The criteria for suspicion was simple and terrible. Any person who seemed out of place, any stranger, any individual who could not immediately account for their whereabouts on Christmas Eve became a target. Several innocent men were seized by these mobs and nearly hanged on the spot. Only the intervention of cooler heads, and in some cases the police themselves, prevented summary executions. The irony was not lost on observers. The same police force that had failed to catch the actual killer now found itself protecting innocents from vigilante justice. The governor of Texas received urgent telegrams from Austin describing the breakdown of order. Martial law was seriously discussed. The idea of bringing in state militia to restore control to the capital city seemed unthinkable, yet the situation demanded consideration of extreme measures. Austin had become a city at war with itself, torn apart by fear and frustration. Neighbor suspected neighbor. Wild theories circulated. Some claimed the killer must be multiple people, perhaps a cult or secret society. Because how else could one person commit such widespread violence in a single night? Others whispered about supernatural explanations, that the Annihilator was not human at all, but some demon or vengeful spirit. Newspapers across the nation picked up the story. The Christmas Massacre, as it came to be known, represented the peak of the terror. Editorial writers demanded federal intervention. Comparisons were drawn to the Unsolved Jack the Ripper murders that would grip London just a few years later, though Austin's nightmare had come first. For days after Christmas, the city remained in a state of near anarchy. Public gatherings were canceled. People barricaded themselves in their homes. Those who ventured out did so armed and in groups. The economic life of the city ground to a halt as businesses closed and commerce ceased. Patsy Gibson miraculously survived. As she recovered enough to speak, investigators pressed her for details about her attacker. Her descriptions were frustratingly vague. The attack had happened so quickly, in darkness, with such violence that she had little clear memory beyond impressions. She thought her attacker might have been tall. The person seemed strong. Beyond that, she could offer nothing definitive. The police, desperate for any lead, followed up on hundreds of tips and rumors. Every strange person, every individual with a criminal past, every traveler passing through Austin became a person of interest. Yet nothing concrete emerged. The killer had left no useful evidence, no witnesses beyond the barely conscious Patsy Gibson, no trail to follow. And then, as suddenly and mysteriously as the terror had begun, it ended. There were no more attacks. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The Annihilator, having reached some terrible climax on Christmas Eve 1885, simply vanished. Whether the killer died, moved away, was arrested for some other crime, or simply satisfied whatever dark compulsion drove the murders, no one could say. The attack stopped, and the nightmare lifted like morning fog burning away in sunlight. But the damage was done. Austin would never be the same. The innocence of the young capital city had been slaughtered as surely as the victims themselves. Trust between neighbors had been broken. Faith in institutions had been shattered. And the questions remained, unanswered, haunting. How could one person execute such coordinated violence across multiple locations? What drove the killer to strike with such fury on Christmas Eve? And perhaps most chilling of all, what force or circumstance caused the murders to stop? Was it choice or chance that ended the reign of terror? The silence that followed the Christmas Massacre was almost as unsettling as the violence that preceded it. Austin held its breath, waiting for the next attack, but it never came. The Annihilator had delivered a final, terrible message and then disappeared into history, leaving only corpses, shattered lives, and questions that echo across more than a century. The morning after Molly Smith's murder, the Austin police found themselves drowning in theories but starved for solid evidence. Every shadow in the city seemed to hold a potential killer, every stranger a possible suspect. In the months that followed, as the body count rose and the panic intensified, the investigation would spin off in a dozen different directions, each one seemingly promising at first, each one ultimately leading nowhere. But among the many threads that detectives and amateur sleuths alike would pull at, certain names and theories would emerge again and again, becoming part of the dark mythology that surrounded the Servant Girl Annihilator. The first person to fall under serious suspicion was a man who had nothing to recommend him as a suspect except his proximity to tragedy and the color of his skin. His name was Maurice, though the newspapers of the day rarely afforded him even that dignity, usually referring to him simply as the Hancock family cook or the Malay servant. Maurice was a Malaysian immigrant who had found work in one of Austin's wealthier households, and his misfortune was to be employed by a family that lived near several of the early attacks. In the atmosphere of hysteria that gripped Austin in 1885, this geographical coincidence was enough to paint a target on his back. The first time police arrested Maurice came just days after the second murder. Officers hauled him from the Hancock kitchen based on nothing more substantial than a neighbor's vague recollection of seeing a dark-skinned man walking near one of the crime scene. Maurice protested his innocence, explained that he had been asleep in his quarters at the time of the murder, pointed out that the Hancock family could vouch for his whereabouts. None of it mattered. The police held him for 3 days, questioned him relentlessly, then released him when another attack occurred while he sat in a cell. You would think that would have been the end of it, that being locked up during a murder would constitute an ironclad alibi. You would be wrong. When the next servant girl died, Maurice was arrested again. The police reasoning, if you could call it that, seemed to be that perhaps he had an accomplice, or that the murder during his incarceration had been a copycat designed to throw suspicion off the real killer. They held him for a week this time, subjected him to what the newspapers delicately termed intensive questioning. The Hancock family again vouched for him, stating that he had been home on the night in question, that he was a quiet, hard-working man who had never shown the slightest tendency toward violence. The police released him, but the damage was done. The newspapers had printed his name, or rather his single name, over and over, always with insinuations, always with the implication that where there was smoke, there must be fire. Maurice was arrested 4 more times over the course of the killing spree. Each time, the evidence was gossamer thin, more impression than fact. Someone thought they had seen a man of his build near a crime scene. A witness claimed to have heard a man speaking in a foreign language fleeing from a murder site, though when pressed, they admitted they could not actually identify what language it was, or whether the words they heard might simply have been the panicked cursing of anyone stumbling through the dark. Each time, Maurice would be hauled from his bed or his kitchen. Each time he would sit in a cell while the police tried to force a confession from him. And each time he would eventually be released for lack of any actual evidence connecting him to the crimes. The treatment of Maurice revealed something ugly at the heart of Austin's investigation. A willingness to let fear and prejudice guide justice. Here was a man whose only crimes were being foreign, being different, and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The police seemed to view him less as a person and more as a convenient receptacle for the city's terror. Someone they could arrest and parade before the public to show that they were doing something. Anything, even when they knew full well they had no case. Newspapers fed into this narrative, describing Maurice in terms that emphasized his otherness, calling him inscrutable and strange, noting the way he spoke English with an accent as though this were somehow evidence of criminal intent. Some editorials went further, suggesting that perhaps his foreign background predisposed him to savage violence, that whatever cultural influences had shaped him in his homeland had made him capable of the brutality visited upon Austin's servant girls. The last time Maurice was arrested came in late December of 1885, shortly after the final 2 murders on Christmas Eve. By this point, even the police seemed to recognize the absurdity of continuing to target him, but public pressure demanded they do something, arrest someone, provide some semblance of resolution. Maurice spent Christmas Day in jail. When the Hancock family threatened to hire an attorney and sue the police department for harassment, he was quietly released. Not long after, Maurice left Austin. Who could blame him? He had been accused 6 times of murders he did not commit, had his name dragged through the mud, had lived for months under the constant threat of arrest. The last mention of him in the Austin newspapers came in February of 1886, a tiny item noting that the Hancock family was seeking a new cook, as their previous employee had departed the city. History does not record where Maurice went or what became of him. He vanished from the story as mysteriously as he had entered it, just another casualty of the Servant Girl Annihilator case, though not in the way the killer's other victims had been. While Maurice was being repeatedly arrested and released, another man found himself caught in the machinery of the investigation. Nathan Elgin was a 19-year-old African-American man who worked odd jobs around Austin, mostly yard work and general labor. He came to police attention because of witness testimony that seemed, at first, devastatingly conclusive. 3 different people claimed to have seen a young black man running from the vicinity of one of the murder scenes, his clothing disheveled, his manner frantic. When police brought Elgin in for questioning, he was exhausted and dirty from a day of labor, and in the dim light of the police station, with 3 witnesses pointing fingers at him, it seemed an open and shut case. But then the case began to crack. Under closer examination, the 3 witnesses who had been so certain began to hedge their bets. One admitted that it had been very dark, that they had seen the running figure only for a moment. Another confessed that they could not actually be sure the man they saw was the same man now sitting before them. The third, when pressed, revealed that they had not actually seen anyone running from a murder scene at all, but had seen Elgin running somewhere else entirely, at a different time, and had simply assumed it must have been connected to the crimes, because, well, why else would a black man be running through a white neighborhood at night? The reasoning was circular, damning, and completely divorced from actual evidence. Nathan Elgin had an alibi for the murder in question. He had been at home with his family, a fact confirmed by his mother, his 2 sisters, and a neighbor who had been visiting that evening. The police, however, dismissed these statements almost immediately. They claimed that of course his family would lie to protect him, that their testimony was inherently unreliable. The double standard was breathtaking. White employers vouching for Maurice had been given some weight, though clearly not enough to prevent his repeated arrests. But black family members vouching for Nathan were presumed to be lying simply by virtue of their relationship and their race. Elgin spent 2 weeks in jail before a local minister, a white man with connections to the mayor, took up his case and applied enough pressure that the police had to acknowledge they had no evidence whatsoever linking the young man to any of the murders. Nathan was released, but like Morris, he bore the scars of having been publicly accused. He left Austin within a month of his release, joining the wave of African Americans who fled the city during and after the killing spree, seeking safety and anonymity elsewhere. As the investigation floundered and the obvious scapegoats proved to be innocent, more elaborate theories began to circulate. One of the most persistent involved not a single killer, but a group of them, specifically a cabal of wealthy young men who were supposedly conducting what they called hunting expeditions through Austin's poorer neighborhood. According to this theory, these sons of prominent families had grown bored with their privileged lives and had turned to murder as a form of entertainment, selecting servant girls as their prey precisely because such victims were vulnerable, and their deaths less likely to generate the kind of intense investigation that the murder of a society lady would provoke. The theory was not entirely without foundation. There had been whispers, rumors of a group of young men who had been seen in the vicinity of one of the crime scenes, who had been drinking heavily and making crude jokes about the murders. Some witnesses claimed to have heard laughter near one of the attacks, the kind of cruel, drunken laughter that speaks to callousness rather than fear. The idea that the killer might be not one man but several, and that these men might be protected by their family's wealth and social standing, explained why the investigation seemed to go nowhere, why promising leads evaporated, why evidence mysteriously disappeared. The theory gained enough traction that the police were forced to investigate it, though their efforts seemed perfunctory at best. They questioned a few young men from prominent families, accepted their denials at face value, and declared the theory baseless. No records were kept of exactly who was questioned or what they said. No serious attempt was made to verify their whereabouts on the nights of the murders. The investigation of the wealthy suspects, if you could call it that, stood in stark contrast to the aggressive, repeated arrests of Maurice and Nathan Elgin. The message was clear. In Austin in 1885, justice had a price tag, and social standing bought you the benefit of the doubt. But of all the suspects and theories that emerged from the Servant Girl Annihilator case, none has proven more enduring or more tantalizing than the unnamed man who fled Austin in late December of 1885, and who some believe resurfaced in London less than 3 years later as the most infamous serial killer in history, Jack the Ripper. This connection, first proposed by crime historians in the 1970s, has been debated ever since, and while it remains speculative, the parallels between the 2 killing sprees are striking enough to give even skeptics pause. The theory goes like this. Shortly after the Christmas Eve murders of 1885, an unidentified man left Austin in a hurry. Several witnesses reported seeing a disheveled man boarding a train out of the city in the early morning hours of December 26th, carrying only a small bag, looking nervous and agitated. The man was described as being in his 30s, of medium build, with dark hair and what one witness called a foreign or possibly English accent. This man, according to the theory, made his way back across the Atlantic, settling in the Whitechapel district of London, where in 1888 he would begin killing again. The similarities between the Servant Girl Annihilator murders and the Jack the Ripper killings are indeed remarkable. Both targeted vulnerable women from the lower classes. Both involved extreme violence and mutilation. Both occurred at night, with the killer appearing and disappearing like a ghost. Both involved victims who were attacked outdoors or in their homes rather than being lured to a specific killing ground. Both demonstrated a level of anatomical knowledge that suggested the killer might have had medical training or at least a detailed understanding of human anatomy. Both killing sprees ended abruptly, the Annihilator murders stopping after Christmas Eve of 1885, the Ripper murders ceasing after November of 1888, as though the killer had once again moved on. There are differences, of course. The Ripper exclusively targeted women he encountered on the streets, prostitutes working the Whitechapel area. The Annihilator attacked servant girls in their beds or their employers' homes. The Ripper's mutilations were, if such a comparison can be made, more surgically precise, suggesting a refinement of technique that might have developed over the 3 years between the two killing sprees. But these differences can be explained as evolution, a killer learning from experience, adapting his methods to a new environment and a new victim pool. Could the same man have committed both series of murders? It is possible. Transatlantic travel was common in the 1880s, and a man with means, or even just determination, could have made the journey. Austin's murders stopped on Christmas Eve of 1885. The Ripper's murders began in August of 1888. That is a gap of 2.5 years, time enough for a killer to relocate, to establish himself in a new city, to feel secure enough to begin hunting again. The theory cannot be proven without evidence that has long since vanished, if it ever existed. But it also cannot be disproven, and that ambiguity has kept it alive in the minds of true crime enthusiasts and historians for decades. Adding another layer to the mystery was a deathbed confession that emerged in the 1920s, 4 decades after the murders. An elderly man, dying in a San Antonio hospital, allegedly told a nurse that he had been the Servant Girl Annihilator, that he had killed those women in Austin all those years ago, that the guilt had haunted him his entire life. The nurse, shaken by the confession, reported it to police, but by the time officers arrived at the hospital, the man had died. He had given the nurse no name, no details that could be verified, nothing but the bare confession itself. Hospital records from that era were incomplete, and no one could definitively identify which patient had made the confession. It might have been the ramblings of a fevered dying mind, the guilty conscience of someone who had nothing to do with the murders, but had become convinced through decades of mental illness that he had. Or it might have been genuine, a real killer finally unburdening himself at the end of his life, taking his identity and his secrets to the grave because he left it too late to provide any proof. The confession was never verified because it could not be verified. There was no way to check the dying man's whereabouts in 1885, no way to match his statement against facts that had been lost to time. The nurse who heard the confession gave several newspaper interviews, insisting the man had seemed lucid and sincere, but sincerity is not evidence. The confession remains one more tantalizing, might have been in a case built almost entirely of might have beens. In the end, every investigation thread unraveled. Maurice was innocent, persecuted for being foreign. Nathan Elgin was innocent, accused for being black, and in the wrong place. The wealthy hunting party theory dissolved under the light of actual scrutiny, though whether because it was false or because it was true but protected remains an open question. The mysterious man who fled to London and became Jack the Ripper remains in the realm of fascinating speculation. The deathbed confession remains unverified and unverifiable. What the investigation into the Servant Girl Annihilator left behind was not answers, but a catalog of all the ways a search for truth can go wrong. All the ways fear and prejudice can corrupt justice. All the ways a killer can slip between the cracks of incompetence and circumstance. and vanish into history. The silence is perhaps the most terrifying part of the story. On Christmas Day, 1885, the city of Austin held its breath, waiting for another scream to pierce the darkness. But it never came. The Servant Girl Annihilator, as the newspapers had dubbed him, had simply vanished into the same shadows from which he had emerged. The killing stopped as abruptly and mysteriously as it had begun, leaving behind only questions that would echo through more than a century of speculation and dread. For 365 days, Austin had lived under a pall of terror, unlike anything experienced in Texas before. 8 women were dead, possibly more. Several men had been brutally attacked trying to defend them. Entire neighborhoods had armed themselves and organized night watches. Yet when the violence ceased, there were no arrests, no confessions, no bodies discovered that might explain the killer's disappearance. He simply stopped, as if he had never existed at all. This abrupt ending has haunted criminologists and historians ever since. Did the Annihilator die, perhaps in some unrelated accident or illness that went unrecorded? Did he leave Austin on one of the many trains that passed through the growing capital city? Or most disturbingly, had he simply satisfied whatever dark compulsion drove him to murder? The hunger finally sated by the blood of his victims. The frustrating reality is that we will never know. The investigation, such as it was, dissolved into finger-pointing and political maneuvering. The evidence, minimal to begin with in an era before fingerprinting, before blood typing, before any real understanding of forensic science, was lost to time. Crime scenes were trampled by curious onlookers within hours of each attack. Potential clues were pocketed as morbid souvenirs. Witness statements contradicted each other wildly, shaped more by racial prejudices and neighborhood gossip than by actual observation. What little physical evidence existed has long since disappeared. The axes and knives used in some attacks were never conclusively matched to a single weapon. The bloody clothing found near some crime scenes was never properly preserved or analyzed. Even the locations themselves have been built over, paved over, transformed by more than a century of urban development. If you walk through East Austin today, you pass unmarked ground where women died screaming in the darkness, their blood soaking into Texas soil that now lies beneath parking lots and apartment buildings. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this cold case is not what was lost, but what was never collected in the first place. Several of the Annihilator's victims were never properly identified. They were listed in records simply as servant girls, colored women, domestic workers whose full names apparently didn't matter enough to the authorities to record with care. Their backgrounds, their families, their stories died with them, considered irrelevant to an investigation that was more interested in protecting white households than in seeking justice for murdered black women. This ugly truth raises a question that disturbs us even now. How many other victims were there? How many attacks went unreported, dismissed as unimportant because they happened in the wrong part of town to the wrong kind of people? Austin in the 1880s was a city deeply divided by race and class. If a domestic worker simply disappeared, if a woman living on the margins of society was found dead, would anyone have connected her death to the Annihilator's spree? Would anyone have cared enough to try? Modern researchers have found hints of other violent deaths during that year, attacks on women that don't appear in the official count, but that bear similar hallmarks. Were these the work of the same killer, or evidence of copycat crimes? The incomplete records make it impossible to know. The victims who didn't matter enough to investigate thoroughly in life remain forgotten in death. Some criminologists who have studied the case now believe that attributing all the murders to a single killer might be incorrect. The attacks showed variations in method and victim selection that could suggest multiple perpetrators. Perhaps Austin suffered not from one monster, but from several, emboldened by the chaos and fear that gripped the city. Perhaps some of the crimes were domestic violence incidents misattributed to the serial killer. Perhaps opportunistic attackers used the terror as cover for their own dark purposes. Other experts point to similarities between the Austin murders and later unsolved cases in other cities. Could the Annihilator have moved on, continuing his work elsewhere under different circumstances? Some have noted parallels to the Whitechapel murders in London that would occur just 3 years later. Could Jack the Ripper have practiced his terrible craft in Texas before moving to England? It's a theory that persists despite having no real evidence to support it, sustained by our desire to impose some pattern on the chaos, to connect the dots even when no connection exists. The truth is simpler and more frightening. Somewhere in Austin's history, a killer walked free. He might have lived out his natural life in the city, perhaps even attending the funerals of his victims, watching the fear he created with satisfaction. He might have moved away and died peacefully in bed decades later, his crimes unknown to those around him. His identity died with him, taking with it any hope of understanding why he killed or how he chose his victims. The city that lived through his reign of terror eventually moved on, as cities always do. The newspaper headlines faded. The night watches disbanded. People stopped barricading their doors and sleeping with weapons close at hand. New scandals and new crimes captured public attention. Within a generation, the Servant Girl Annihilator was becoming a footnote in Austin's history, a half-remembered nightmare that parents might mention to scare children into coming home before dark. But the most haunting aspect of this story is not the killer's escape or even the mystery of his identity. It's how quickly the city forgot the names of the women who died. Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Susan Hancock, Gracie Vance, Orange Washington, Lucinda Body, Eula Phillips. These names, painstakingly recovered by researchers more than a century later, meant so little at the time that they were often recorded incorrectly or not at all. The women became anonymous victims in retellings of the tale, their individual humanity erased by the passage of time and the prejudices of their era. This is the real legacy of the Servant Girl Annihilator Dark Data. Not just the unsolved mystery of his identity, but the uncomfortable truth about which victims we remember and which we allow ourselves to forget. The case remains uniquely terrifying not only because a killer was never caught, but because it reveals how easily the vulnerable can be erased from history, their deaths treated as less important than the fear experienced by those who survived. Somewhere beneath Austin's modern streets, in unmarked graves or long-forgotten plots, rest women whose killers face no justice. Their screams have faded into silence. Their names have nearly vanished from memory. And the man who murdered them in the darkness of 1885 walked away, leaving behind only questions that will never be answered, and a chill that refuses to fade even after more than a century has passed. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.